The wind sweeping down from the panhandle did not howl. It shrieked. It was the sound of winter arriving early in 1874, carrying the scent of snow and the bitter promise that the Texas earth would soon be as hard as iron. Eliza May Carver leaned her entire weight against the rough hemp rope, her boots slipping on the frozen mud. Behind her, the pine log, stripped of its bark, but still green and heavy with sap, dragged reluctantly over the rocky ground. It was the fourth log she had moved that morning, and the sun was not yet high enough to offer any true warmth. Her breath plumed in the air, vanishing as quickly as it came. She was 30 years old, though the last 6 months had etched lines around her eyes that belonged to a woman of 40. She had no husband to swing the axe, no sons to hold the other end of the timber. She had only her own 2 hands, currently wrapped in tattered buckskin gloves that were wearing thin at the palms. "Move," she whispered, the word a command to the wood and a plea to her own aching shoulders. She dug her heels in. The log groaned, sliding another 2 feet. It was a small victory, but in Willow Draw, small victories were the only kind available. High above her, on the jagged spine of a limestone ridge that overlooked the valley, he was watching. He sat so still that a hawk circling overhead might have mistaken him for a part of the stone. His name was Tubé, in the tongue of the white settlers. It meant nothing, but to his people, it meant quiet wind. He was a Comanche warrior who had outlived his war and outlived his heart. He was not hunting. His rifle lay across his knees, uncocked. He was simply observing. From his vantage point, the woman looked small, a dark speck of stubborn determination against the vast, gray canvas of the scrubland. He watched her stumble, correct her balance, and heave again. Most white settlers he had seen were loud and clumsy, tearing at the earth with a greed that made no sense. But this woman was different. She moved with a desperate economy. Tubé narrowed his eyes. She was building the outline of a home. He watched her drag the timber to a rectangular clearing she had leveled near the creek. He saw her check the alignment. A sharp, phantom pain twisted in his chest. It was not a physical wound, but the memory of a lodge warmer than this wind, of a fire that never smoked, and of a woman who used to hum while she worked hides. That life was gone. The cholera and the cavalry had swept it away, leaving him with nothing but the silence of the high ridges. He should have hated her. She was an intruder on land that had once been the wintering ground of the antelope band. But as he watched her fall to her knees, gasping for air, then force herself back up to grab the rope again, he felt no hatred. He felt a strange, hollow kinship. She was building a shelter against the cold. He knew what it was to be cold. By mid-afternoon, the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. Eliza decided that the logs would have to wait. If she did not get the corner posts set before the ground froze solid, there would be no cabin, only a pile of timber and a frozen corpse come January. She took up the post-hole digger, a rusted tool she had bartered for in Red Mesa, and began to drive it into the soil. The rhythm was grueling. Lift, slam, twist, pull, lift, slam, twist, pull. The earth at Willow Draw was deceptive. On the surface, it was soft red dirt, but 6 inches down lay a bed of clay and limestone rock. Her shoulders burned. The silence of the valley was absolute, broken only by the thud of the iron blades and the rush of the stream nearby. She was thinking about the town. She tried not to, but the memory of yesterday's trip to Red Mesa stung worse than the blisters on her hands. She had walked into the general store, the bell above the door announcing her presence. The warmth of the potbelly stove had hit her, smelling of coffee and tobacco. Conversations had stopped. Men leaning against the counter had straightened up, their eyes tracking her with a mixture of suspicion and predatory curiosity. She had approached the counter, counting the coins in her pocket. $4.60. That was all that remained of the sale of her wedding ring. "I need 10 pounds of nails," Eliza had said, keeping her voice steady. "And a cross-cut saw, if you have one used." The proprietor, a man with a grease-stained apron and eyes like flint, had not smiled. He placed the nails on the counter slowly. "You're the one out at Willow Draw." It was not a question. "I am." "That is Vernon Slade's range." the man said. He did not look at her. He looked past her, as if speaking to the air. Slade runs 3,000 head of cattle through that valley come spring. He needs that water. The land office in Austin says the deed is unclaimed, Eliza replied, her chin lifting slightly. I filed the paperwork. It is legal. A woman standing near the fabric bolts. Eliza later learned her name was Clara Pike. The wife of the town's banker let out a sharp, derisive sniff. Legal does not make it wise, dear, and a woman out there alone, it is unnatural. It brings bad luck. Decent women know their places in a town, under a roof provided by a husband. Eliza had felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she refused to look away. My husband is dead, ma'am, and the town of Red Mesa has made it clear I have no place here, so I will make my own roof. She had paid for the nails. She did not have enough for the saw. Now, standing in the growing dusk of the valley, Eliza slammed the digger down with a surge of anger. Unnatural. That was the word. They thought she was broken goods, a woman without a protector, and therefore a threat to their orderly world. Clink! The sound was sharp and metallic, jarring her wrists. Eliza frowned. She had expected rock, but that sound was different. It rang. She knelt in the dirt, ignoring the dampness soaking into her skirt. She used her gloved hands to scoop away the loose soil. 6 inches down, something glinted in the fading light. It was not a stone. It was a corner of metal, working faster now, driven by curiosity. She dug around the object. It was a box, perhaps 8 inches long, made of tin that had rusted in patches but remained intact. It had been buried with purpose, wedged beneath a flat rock to keep it from shifting. Eliza pulled it free. It was heavy for its size. She sat back on her heels, the box resting in her lap. The wind whistled through the dead grass, sounding like a warning. She should be working. Darkness was coming, but her fingers trembled as she pried at the lid. The rust held it fast for a moment, then gave way with a screech. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had grown brittle with age, was a stack of papers. Eliza wiped her hands on her apron before touching them. The paper was thick, expensive bond, yellowed at the edges. She unfolded the top sheet. It was covered in handwriting that was elegant and sweeping, dated 1869, 5 years ago. It was a land survey. But it was not just a survey of the surface. There were notations about water flow, calculated volume, and markings that Eliza, daughter of a surveyor, recognized immediately. Permanent aquifer access. Primary flow. Beneath the survey was a map. It was hand-drawn, detailing Willow Draw and the surrounding canyons. A thick red line traced the creek, but another line, dotted in secret, led to a spot further up the canyon wall, marked with a symbol she did not recognize. At the bottom of the box, beneath the papers, lay a heavy lump of red wax, stamped with a seal and a brass key. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. Vernon Slade wanted this valley for cattle, the store owner had said, but cattle drank from the surface. This map spoke of something else, something valuable enough that someone had buried it to keep it safe. She looked up, suddenly feeling exposed. The valley walls felt like the sides of a trap. If Slade knew this was here, if he knew what the water in Willow Draw really meant. You are not just digging a home. Eliza, she whispered to the empty air. You are digging a grave if you are not careful. Toubé had not moved, but his attention had shifted. He saw the woman stop working. He saw her pull something from the earth. He could not see what it was from this distance, but he saw her posture change. She went from the weary hunch of a laborer to the rigid alertness of a deer catching a scent. She looked around, her head turning quickly, scanning the tree line. She was afraid. Toubé adjusted his blanket around his shoulders. He knew fear. He lived with it as a constant companion, but he also noticed something else about her. Earlier, when the wind had picked up, he had watched her drive the corner stakes. She did not just pound them in. She had checked the prevailing wind direction, licking a finger and holding it up, then angled the broad side of the future cabin to slice the wind rather than catch it. That was not something a town woman did. That was something a survivor did. Most white women he had seen were like wilting flowers, terrified of the silence, screaming at the sight of a lizard. This one worked until her hands bled, and she knew how to read the wind. He respected that. He stood up slowly, his knees popping softly. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. It was time to find his own shelter for the night. He had a small camp hidden 2 miles east, in a box canyon where the wind could not reach. As he turned to go, his gaze swept the valley floor one last time. Movement, far to the south, near the entrance of the draw where the trail from Red Mesa widened. Shadows were lengthening, but these shadows moved against the wind. Tubey froze. He raised a hand to shield his eyes against the dying light. A rider. No, just a horse. A single rider had come to the edge of the valley, stopped, and was now turning back. It was too far to see the man's face, but Tubey could read the horse. It moved with the heavy, shod gait of a grain-fed animal, not the nimble step of a Mustang. A white man's horse. The rider had not come to visit. He had not ridden up to the fire to announce himself. He had stayed in the tree line, watching the woman, and then circled back. Tubey felt a prickle of unease on the back of his neck. In the Comancheria, if a man wanted to speak, he approached. If he wanted to kill, he came at dawn. But a man who watched from the shadows and rode in circles, that was a man marking territory, like a wolf pissing on a boundary line. The woman, down by her pile of logs, had not seen the rider. She was too busy staring at whatever she had pulled from the hole. Tubey hesitated. It was not his fight. The problems of white settlers were the problems of ghosts. Let them kill each other over lines on paper in muddy water. He had his own ghosts to attend to. He turned his back on the valley and began the descent down the far side of the ridge, his moccasins making no sound on the stone. But as he walked, the image of the woman's bent back stayed with him, irritating him like a burr stuck in his leggings. 2 days passed. The cold deepened. Eliza had managed to set the 4 corner posts. They stood like lonely sentinels in the emptiness, defining a space that was 12 feet by 14 feet. It was small, but it was hers. She had hidden the tin box, not in the tent where she slept, a canvas lean-to that flapped violently in the night, but inside a hollow beneath the roots of a massive cottonwood tree near the creek bank. She had covered the spot with river stones and dead leaves. The feeling of being watched had not left her. It was late afternoon when she went to the creek to fill her bucket. The water was violently cold, numbing her fingers instantly. As she hauled the bucket up the bank, her boot caught on a root, and she stumbled. She steadied herself, spilling half the water, and looked down. There, stamped into the mud of the creek bank, was a hoof print. Eliza set the bucket down. Her heart gave a hard, painful thud. The print was fresh. The edges were sharp, not yet eroded by the wind, and it was shod with iron. She had no horse. Her mule, Barnaby, was tethered on the other side of the clearing, and his hooves were unshod, trimmed round. This print belonged to a large horse, a gelding, likely, and it had been here recently. She followed the track. It did not come from the road. It came from the scrub oak thicket to the west, circled behind the spot where she had pitched her tent, and then looped back toward the water. Someone had walked their horse within 10 feet of where she slept. Eliza felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather seep into her bones. She spun around, scanning the tree line. The woods were silent. The gray trunks of the oaks looked like prison bars. "Hello," she called out. Her voice sounded thin and pathetic in the vastness. "Is anyone there?" A crow answered with a harsh caw, taking flight from a branch. She was being hunted, or at least, she was being studied. The rumors in town. Vernon Slade. Builds there does not live in peace. Fear threatened to paralyze her, to make her drop to the ground and weep. She wanted to run. She wanted to pack her mule and flee back to the misery of a boarding house in the city, where at least there were walls and gas lamps and policemen. But she looked at the 4 posts she had set. She looked at the logs she had dragged until her hands bled. If she ran now, she would be running until she died. She was 27 years old, and she had run from a loveless marriage. Then from the shame of widowhood. Then from a landlord who wanted more than rent. She had run enough. Eliza grabbed the bucket of water. She walked back to her camp, forcing her steps to be measured and loud. "I am not leaving," she said through gritted teeth. She gathered wood for the fire. Not just a cooking fire, but a big one. If they were watching, let them see. Night fell like a heavy curtain. The stars over Texas were brilliant and indifferent. Shards of ice scattered on black velvet. Eliza sat on a log near her fire. The flames leaped and danced, casting long, jumping shadows against the canvas of her tent. She had her father's Walker Colt revolver in her lap. It was heavy, and the oil on the cylinder gleamed in the firelight. She did not know if she could hit a man in the dark, but she knew she would pull the trigger if she had to. She added another branch to the fire. The smoke rose, a thin, gray ribbon climbing straight up into the still, freezing air. High above, on the ridge. Tube watched the spark in the darkness. He had not returned to his camp. He had stayed. He told himself it was to ensure the rider did not return, to protect the valley that had once been his, but he knew it was a lie. He was drawn to the fire. He sat cross-legged on the stone, the wind biting at his exposed face. In his hand, he held a small pouch made of soft doe skin. It was beaded with intricate patterns, blue for the sky, red for the blood of life. He opened the pouch and tipped it into his palm. A small, polished stone and a lock of black hair, tied with a sinew string, fell out. His wife's name had been Mourning Dove. She had laughed often. She had smelled of sage and sweetgrass. When the coughing sickness took her, she had been holding this stone. The fire down in the valley flickered, a tiny island of light in a sea of darkness. Tube closed his hand over the charm. The pain of the memory was sharp, tearing at a wound he had tried to sew shut with silence and solitude. He looked at the woman's fire, then at the vast, empty sky where his family should have been. He was a warrior without a war, a husband without a wife, a father without a child. Down there, the white woman was trying to build a world out of logs and stubbornness. She was fighting the dark. Tube felt a single tear track through the dust on his cheek. It was cold before it reached his jaw. "Build your fire, woman," he whispered in his own tongue, the words snatched away by the wind. "Build it high. The wolves are coming." He did not descend. He did not approach, but he did not leave. As the moon rose, casting a pale, bone-white light over the snow-dusted canyon, two solitary figures kept their vigil, one by the fire, one on the stone separated by 1,000 feet of darkness, but bound together by the smoke that rose to meet the stars. The storm did not arrive with a warning. It arrived with a hammer blow. 3 nights after Eliza had found the tin box, the wind shifted violently to the north. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in the span of a single hour. The sky, which had been a clear, hard blue all day, was suddenly swallowed by a wall of bruising purple clouds that rolled over the limestone ridges like a stampede of dark horses. Eliza was not ready. She was still living in the canvas lean-to pitched inside the perimeter of her half-finished cabin. The logs were only stacked 3 high on 2 sides, offering no real protection. As the first gale-force wind struck Willow Draw, the canvas snapped so loudly it sounded like a pistol shot. Eliza scrambled to secure the ropes, her fingers numb and clumsy inside her gloves. Snow began to fall, not in soft flakes, but in hard, driving pellets that stung her face like buckshot. The fire she had carefully tended was flattened, the coals hissing and dying under the onslaught of wind and ice. Then came the sound that chilled her blood faster than the freezing air. It started as a low yip, echoing off the canyon walls, and was answered by a deeper, guttural snarl. Wolves. They were not the solitary, skittish coyotes she had heard singing at the moon. These were gray wolves, driven down from the high country by the sudden freeze, hungry and emboldened by the scent of a lone woman and a mule. Barnaby, her mule, screamed a high, terrified bray and strained against his tether on the far side of the clearing. "Easy, Barnaby." "Ooh," Eliza shouted, though the wind tore the words from her mouth. She grabbed the Walker Colt revolver from her bedding roll. The metal was ice cold, burning her palm. She stumbled out of the lean-to, her boots sinking into the rapidly accumulating drift. The darkness was absolute. Save for the faint, gray luminescence of the snow, she saw them, 3 pairs of yellow eyes reflecting the faint light, low to the ground, moving with a fluid. Terrifying silence. They were circling the mule. Barnaby was kicking out, his hooves flashing. But the wolves were smart. They were weaving in and out, testing his range, waiting for him to tire. Eliza raised the heavy pistol. Her arm shook violently, not just from the cold, but from a primal terror that seized her chest. She had never fired at a moving target in the dark. If she missed, she might hit the mule. If she hit nothing, they might turn on her. One of the wolves lunged, snapping at Barnaby's hocks. The mule panicked, rearing up and tearing the tether rope free. He bolted into the darkness, crashing through the brush. The wolves turned. They did not chase the mule. They turned their heads toward the smaller, slower prey standing by the collapsed fire. Eliza cocked the hammer. The click sounded deafening. A large male, gaunt and ragged, stepped forward. He bared his teeth, a low rumble vibrating in his chest. He was 10 feet away, 8 feet. Eliza stopped breathing. She centered the sight on the animal's chest, praying the old powder in the cartridge would ignite. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the blackness of the tree line. It moved faster than the wolves. It was a blur of motion that intercepted the pack leader. A heavy object flew through the air, landing with a wet thud in the snow 5 yards to the left. It was a fresh deer haunch, bleeding and raw. The scent of fresh blood hit the starving animals instantly. The leader snapped his head around, his instincts overriding his aggression. He lunged for the meat. The other 2 followed, a snarling tangle of fur and teeth fighting over the prize. In that second of distraction, a hand clamped onto Eliza's arm. She screamed, swinging the pistol around. The grip was iron hard. The figure twisted her wrist not to break it, but to force the barrel of the gun toward the sky. The gun went off with a roar and a flash of orange flame that blinded her for a second. "Move!" a voice rasped, close to her ear. It was deep and rough, like stones grinding together. She was hauled backward, her boots skidding on the ice. The stranger pulled her away from the open clearing, dragging her toward the lee side of the stacked logs where the wind was blocked. He shoved her down into the corner, putting his body between her and the wolves. Eliza scrambled back against the rough bark of the logs, blinking the spots from her eyes. She leveled the gun again, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Stay back!" she shrieked. "I will shoot you!" The stranger did not flinch. He stood in a crouch, watching the wolves as they dragged the meat into the darkness of the trees. Only when the sounds of their feeding faded did he turn his head to look at her. It was the Comanche. Up close, he was terrifying. He was tall, his shoulders broad under a heavy buffalo robe. His hair was long and black, braided with strips of otter fur, but his face was unpainted. In the faint reflection of the snow, she saw high cheekbones, a nose like a hawk's beak, and eyes that were dark, intelligent, and infinitely weary. He was less than 3 feet away. The tension in the small, sheltered corner was electric. Eliza could see the steam of his breath mingling with hers. She could smell him wood smoke, cured leather, and the faint, copper scent of the deer blood on his hands. He looked at the gun barrel trembling in her hand, then up at her face. There was no savagery in his gaze. There was no lust. There was only a cold, hard discipline and a sorrow so deep it unnerved her more than anger would have. "Put the weapon down, woman," he said. His English was accented, the vowels flattened, but clear. "If I wanted you dead, the wolves would have finished you." Eliza's finger hovered over the trigger. Her mind screamed that he was the enemy, the savage that the townspeople warned about. But her instincts, the same instincts that told her how to read the wind, told her something else. He had saved her. He had given up food to save her. Slowly, agonizingly. She lowered the pistol, but she did not uncock the hammer. "Who are you?" she whispered. "I am Tube," he said. He did not offer a translation. He reached into the folds of his robe. Eliza tensed, bringing the gun up an inch. But he did not pull a knife. He pulled out a coil of rawhide rope and a thick folded piece of oilcloth tarp. He dropped them at her feet. Next to them, he placed a strip of dried venison jerky. "Your shelter is weak," he said, gesturing to the flapping lean-to. "The wind will kill you before the wolves come back. Cover the corner. Tie it down." Eliza looked at the items, then back at him. She felt a flush of shame mixed with her fear. She was shivering violently now, the adrenaline crash leaving her weak. "I do not need your charity," she said, her voice shaking. "I can take care of myself." Tubé looked at her. For a moment, a flicker of something passed through his eyes, amusement, respect. "This is not charity," he said. "It is the law of winter. The strong help the weak to stand. So the dead do not clutter the land." He stood up, towering over her. "Fix your roof, and keep your fire small. Big fires cast big shadows." Before she could answer, before she could ask why he was watching her, he turned and melted back into the storm. He moved with such silence that if not for the footprints he left in the snow, she might have imagined him. Eliza sat alone in the dark, the heavy buffalo jerky in one hand and the gun in the other. The wind howled outside her small corner of safety, but for the first time that night, she did not feel entirely alone. The sun rose on a world of blinding white. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence so profound it hurt the ears. Eliza crawled out from under the oilcloth tarp she had rigged up in the night. Tubé's tarp. It was heavy, waterproof, and smelled of grease, but it had kept the snow off her. She looked at her cabin. Disaster. The north wall, the one she had struggled with for a week, had buckled inward. The wind had caught the unfinished structure and twisted it. 2 logs had slipped their notches and fallen, cracking the one beneath them. The frame was leaning dangerously. Eliza wanted to scream. She wanted to fall into the snow and weep until she froze. All that work, all that blood, gone in one night. But she did not weep. She stood up and brushed the snow from her skirt. "Right," she said, her voice flat. "Fix it." To fix it, she needed leverage, and she needed more nails. She had used the last of her supply bracing the corner posts, and they had not been enough. The wood had warped in the freeze, popping the cheap iron spikes she had bought. She needed to go to Red Mesa. It took her 2 hours to track down Barnaby. The mule was shivering in a thicket of scrub oak a mile downstream, unharmed but grumpy. It took another hour to saddle him and ride the 6 miles to town. Red Mesa looked different in the snow. The mud of the main street was frozen into jagged ruts. Smoke poured from the chimneys of the false front buildings, promising warmth that Eliza knew she would not be welcomed into. She tied Barnaby to the rail outside the general store. As she walked up the steps, she noticed a group of men standing on the porch of the saloon next door. Vernon Slade was there. He was a big man, heavy in the gut but solid, wearing a coat with a beaver fur collar that cost more than Eliza's land. He was smoking a cigar, the blue smoke curling around his ruddy face. "Well now," Slade called out, his voice booming. "If it isn't the Queen of Willow Draw. Surprised you didn't freeze solid last night, Mrs. Carver?" The men around him chuckled. It was a low, ugly sound. Eliza stopped, her hand on the door latch. She turned to face him. The cabin held, "Mr. Slade, thank you for your concern." Slade took a drag of his cigar, his eyes narrowing. "Cabin, that pile of sticks, you are stubborn. I will give you that. But stubbornness does not keep the wolves away. Or the savages." He stepped off the porch, crunching the snow under his polished boots. He stopped a few feet from her. "My boys say they saw tracks out your way, unshod ponies. Comanche," he let the word hang in the air. The other men went quiet. "I have seen no ponies." Eliza lied. Her heart was beating fast. "Is that so?" Slade smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Strange. Rumor is there is a buck who has taken a shine to you. Some lone wolf. Maybe you are leaving a lantern out for him. A woman alone gets lonely." "I suppose." Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. It was a vile accusation. one calculated to destroy whatever shred of reputation she had left. "You have a filthy mind, Mr. Slade," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "And a desperate one. If you must invent lies to scare a woman off her land—" "It is not a lie if the town believes it," Slade said softly, so only she could hear. "Go home, Mrs. Carver, before the winter takes more than just your wood." Eliza turned and shoved the door of the general store open, the bell jingling cheerfully. A stark contrast to the venom outside. The store was warm, but the reception was glacial. Clara Pike was behind the counter today, her husband nowhere to be seen. She was a bird-like woman with sharp eyes and a mouth permanently pursed in judgment. "I need 5 pounds of nails," Eliza said, walking to the counter. "And credit, Mrs. Pike, just until the spring thaw. I can trade labor. I can sew." Clara Pike did not look up from her ledger. "No credit. Not for you, Mrs. Pike. Please, my wall buckled. If I do not fix it, then you should move on," Clara snapped, looking up. Her eyes were hard. "We do not want trouble here. Eliza, Vernon says you are enticing the Indians. He says you are practically inviting them to raid us." "Vernon Slade is a liar and a thief," Eliza cried, her control snapping. "He wants my water. He is a pillar of this community," Clara hissed. "And you are a stray, a woman who lives in the dirt like an animal. We do not support that kind of behavior. No credit, cash, or get out." Eliza stood there, her hands clenched into fists on the countertop. She had $2 left. It was not enough for the nails she needed, not at the prices they charged her. "I will take 1 pound," Eliza said quietly, "and a box of matches." Clara weighed the nails with agonizing slowness, taking one out to balance the scale perfectly. She took Eliza's money without touching her hand. Eliza walked out of the store, her head high, but inside she was crumbling. 1 pound of nails. It would fix nothing. The ride back to Willow Draw was long and silent. The cold seemed to seep through her coat and settle in her marrow. She was going to fail. Slade would win. She would be forced to sell the land for pennies and leave. Just another failure in a long line of them. When she reached the clearing, the sun was already dipping behind the western ridge. She dismounted and led Barnaby to the creek to drink. She broke the thin layer of ice on the water's edge with her heel. As the mule drank, Eliza looked at the frozen mud. There, on a flat rock that sat in the middle of the stream crossing, lay a bundle. It was wrapped in a piece of darker leather, tied with a strip of sinew. It had not been there when she left. Eliza waded into the shallow water, ignoring the icy bite on her boots. She picked up the bundle. It was heavy. She carried it to the bank and untied the sinew. Inside lay 2 things. The first was a saw. It was not new, but it was a masterpiece of tools, a distant handsaw with a handle of polished applewood and a blade that shone with oil. The teeth were set perfectly, sharp enough to shave with. It was a carpenter's dream, worth $10 easily. The second was a heavy canvas sack filled with nails. Eliza opened the sack and poured a few into her hand. They were not the cheap, brittle wire nails from the general store. These were square-cut iron nails, black and heavy. They were blacksmith forged, the kind used for building bridges or railroad trestles. They were virtually indestructible. There were easily 20 pounds of them. Eliza stared at the treasure in her hands. This was a fortune. This was survival. But where had they come from? "Tube," she whispered. He had been here while she was gone, but why and how a Comanche warrior did not walk into a hardware store and buy a distance saw. He did not forge iron nails. A cold knot of suspicion tightened in her stomach. These were white man's tools, expensive tools, the kind of tools one might find in a stolen wagon train. Or perhaps in the supplies of a wealthy cattleman. Did he steal them from Slade? If he did, and Slade found them here, Eliza would be branded a thief and an accomplice, or worse. Was he working for Slade? Was this a trap, plant the stolen goods, then have the sheriff ride out and find them? Eliza looked up at the ridge, searching for the silhouette she knew would be there. "What game are you playing?" she asked the wind. She should throw them in the creek. She should bury them and never touch them. But she looked at her broken wall. She looked at the darkening sky. The law of winter. She repeated his words. She put the nails back in the sack. She would use them. If it was a trap, she would spring it, but she would have a wall standing when she did. That night, Eliza did not sleep. She sat inside the newly braced corner of her cabin, the black nails bit into the wood like teeth, holding the logs rigid against the wind, and cleaned her gun. Around midnight, a sound startled her. It was faint, barely audible over the crackle of her small fire, the sound of metal scraping against stone. Eliza blew out the lantern immediately. She crawled to the opening of the cabin, pressing herself against the floor logs. She peered out into the clearing. The moon was behind a cloud, but she could see a shape moving near the big cottonwood tree by the creek. Someone was there. They were not approaching the cabin. They were kneeling at the base of the tree. Eliza's heart stopped. The tin box. She had hidden it there, beneath the roots, covered with stones. The figure was digging. She could hear the clink of a shovel or a knife hitting the rocks she had placed. It was not Tube. The figure was too bulky. The movements too clumsy and loud. It was a white man, wearing a heavy coat. Eliza raised the Walker Colt, resting the barrel on the log. The range was too far for a sure shot in the dark, nearly 50 yards. If she fired, she would likely miss, and he would return fire. She watched, holding her breath. The figure stopped digging. He struck a match. The sudden flare of light illuminated a bearded face, one of the men from the porch with Slade. She couldn't be sure. He held the match down to the hole. He paused, then cursed loudly. The sound carried clearly in the cold air. "Empty," he growled. He stood up and kicked the dirt back into the hole. Eliza let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She had moved the box. After finding the mysterious nails that afternoon, a paranoid instinct had screamed at her. If he was here to leave a gift, he could have been here to search. So, before dusk, she had dug up the box and moved it. It was currently wrapped in her spare petticoat, buried beneath the pile of firewood right next to where she lay. The man by the river looked toward the cabin. For a moment, Eliza thought he might come closer. She cocked the hammer of the Colt, the sound muffled by the wind. But the man turned away. He mounted a horse that had been tethered in the brush and rode off toward the south, back toward Red Mesa. Eliza lowered the gun, her forehead resting against the cold wood of the log. They knew. They didn't just want the land for cattle. They knew about the box. They knew about the secret, and now they knew she had it. High above, on the ridge, Tube watched the rider leave. He had seen the man digging. He had seen the woman watching. He fingered the handle of the knife at his belt. The web was tightening. The woman was smart. She had moved the prize. But smart was not enough against men like Slade. He looked at the cabin, where the new nails held the wood together against the wind. He had given her iron to build a home. Now, he realized, he would have to give her more than iron if he wanted her to live to see it finished. He stood up, the decision settling in his chest like a heavy stone. The time for watching was over. The time for war was coming back. The morning sun did not bring warmth, but it brought clarity. The storm had scrubbed the sky clean, leaving it a piercing, relentless blue. Eliza stood in the center of the clearing, the bag of iron nails heavy at her feet. She looked up at the ridge. He was there, of course. He was always there, a silhouette cut from the same stone he sat upon. She took a breath that stung her lungs and raised her hand, signaling him to come down. It took him 20 minutes to descend the scree slope. He moved with a fluidity that made her feel clumsy and loud. When he reached the edge of the clearing, he stopped. He did not cross the invisible line of the tree stumps she had cleared the week before. Eliza walked toward him, stopping exactly 10 feet away. She gripped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, not from cold, but to keep her hands from trembling. "We need to have an understanding," she said. Her voice was steady, practiced in the silence of the night before. Tube looked at her. His face was unreadable, the lines around his eyes etched deep by sun and sorrow. He waited. "I cannot build this alone," Eliza admitted. The words tasted like ash, but she forced them out. And you seem intent on watching me try. You brought the nails, you saved me from the wolves. I do not know why, and I'm not asking for your story." She pointed a gloved finger at the ground between them. "But if you are going to help, we do it my way. You come only when the sun is up. You leave when it touches the western ridge. You do not step foot inside my tent, and you do not touch my personal things. We build the cabin. Nothing else." Tubei studied her finger, then her face. A ghost of a movement twitched at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement. "The wind does not ask permission to blow," he said quietly. "But a fire needs a hearth to be useful. I accept your terms." He stepped forward, crossing the line. "Show me the wood." The days that followed fell into a rhythm that was grueling, exhausting, and strangely peaceful. They worked in silence mostly. The sound of the valley became the rhythm of the axe and the saw. Thwack, rasp. Thwack, rasp. Eliza quickly learned that while she understood the mathematics of a corner notch, how to measure the dovetail so water would run off and not rot the wood, Tubei understood the soul of the timber. On the second day, Eliza selected a tall, thick pine near the creek. It was straight as a ship's mast. She marked it with her chalk. Tubei shook his head. He walked to the tree and placed his palm against the bark. He tapped it with the handle of his knife. "No," he said. "It is straight," Eliza argued, wiping sweat from her forehead. "It will make a perfect sill log." "It is twisted inside," Tubei said. "The wind caught it when it was a sapling. If you cut it, it will warp when it dries. It will pull your house apart." He led her 50 yards uphill to a tree that looked slightly bowed at the base, but straightened out toward the crown. "This one. The roots are deep in rock. The wood is hard. It will not move." Eliza trusted him. They felled the tree, and when they split it later for floorboards, the grain was straight and true, just as he had said. Eliza taught him in return. She showed him how to use the plumb line, a simple string with a lead weight, to ensure the walls rose perpendicular to the earth. She showed him how to mix clay and grass to make chinking that would not crack in the heat. "You measure everything," Tubei observed one afternoon as they sat on opposite ends of a log, eating a lunch of hardtack and dried apples. "If you do not measure, you make mistakes," Eliza said. "Mistakes cost time. I do not have time." "Nature does not measure," he replied, looking out over the valley. "The river finds its path without a line." "I am not a river," Eliza snapped, a sudden flash of defensiveness rising. "I am a woman trying to keep a roof over her head so men like Vernon Slade do not kick me into the dust." She took a bite of the apple, chewing angrily. "Back in St. Louis, they told me a woman without a husband is like a vine without a trellis. They said I would rot on the ground. My father taught me to survey land, to read maps, to calculate load-bearing walls. But when he died, the town did not care what I knew. They only cared that I was 28 and unmarried. They took his business. They took the house." She looked at Tubei, daring him to pity her. "I came west because the land office said they did not care about gender, only the filing fee. I am terrified. Tubei, every day I am terrified. But I will not be a vine." Tubei looked away from her, turning his gaze toward the east, where the plains stretched out endlessly. The wind ruffled the feathers tied in his hair. "Fear is a tool," he said softly. "It sharpens the eyes." He touched the pouch at his belt, the one Eliza had seen him holding that first night. "I had a lodge once," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "It was not made of logs. It was made of buffalo hides, sewn by a woman whose laugh sounded like water over stones. We had a son. He was 3 winters old." Eliza stopped chewing. The silence stretched between them, heavy and fragile. "The sickness came from the soldiers' blankets," Tubei continued, speaking to the horizon. "Smallpox, it takes the breath, it takes the skin." He paused, his hand tightening on his knee until the knuckles turned white. "I burned the lodge. I burned everything. Now I watch the wind. I look east, where they walked to the spirit land, and I wonder why I was left behind." Eliza felt a lump form in her throat. She looked at the man sitting 10 feet away, a savage in the eyes of the town, a monster in the stories of the settlers, and saw a reflection of her own hollowed-out heart. "You were left," Eliza said gently. "Perhaps because you still have something to build." Tubey stood up abruptly, breaking the moment. "The sun is moving. We need 2 more logs before dark." He walked back to the work site, but when he passed her, he paused for the briefest second. He did not look at her, but he slowed his step, allowing her to fall in beside him. 1 log at a time, 1 notch cut, 1 pin driven. With every timber they hoisted into place, the wall between them lowered by an inch. The town of Red Mesa, however, was not idle. Vernon Slade sat in the back room of the sheriff's office, a bottle of whiskey on the table between him and Deputy Ezekiel Ward. Ward was a large man, a black man who had served with the 10th Cavalry, the Buffalo Soldiers, before drifting into this town. He was the blacksmith and the deputy, a man who lived on the edges of acceptance, tolerated for his strength and his badge, but never truly welcomed. "The deadline is clear." "Ezekiel," Slade said, pouring amber liquid into a dirty glass. "The Homestead Act requires a habitable dwelling, 4 walls, a roof, a door, and a window. She has been out there 3 months. Winter is here. She has walls, maybe, but no roof. She has time until the inspector comes from Austin," Ezekiel said, his voice deep and rumbling. He did not touch the whiskey. "That is not until spring. The inspector is not coming from Austin." Slade smiled, a predator showing his teeth. "I received a letter. Due to the weather, the district judge has appointed a local proxy to verify the claims." "Me?" Ezekiel frowned. "You cannot judge a claim on land you want to buy. Mr. Slade, that is a conflict of interest." "It is only a conflict if someone complains," Slade said, sliding a heavy envelope across the table. It made a thick, slapping sound. "And who will complain? She is a woman alone, a woman who, rumor has it, is consorting with a renegade Comanche." Ezekiel looked at the envelope. He knew what was inside. It was enough money to pay off the debts he had incurred buying his forge, enough to leave this town and start over somewhere where people did not look through him. "You want me to serve her an eviction notice," Ezekiel said heavily. "I want you to enforce the law," Slade corrected. "Go out there, inspect the structure. If it is not finished and we know it is not, you post the notice. She has 7 days to vacate. If she is not gone, we burn the structure as a hazard and the land reverts to the public trust, which I will then purchase." Ezekiel stared at the envelope. He thought of Eliza Carver, the woman with the calloused hands and the desperate eyes. He respected her, but respect did not pay for iron or coal. "I will go out there," Ezekiel said, taking the envelope. "But I will not burn her out. Slade, I will only post the notice." Slade chuckled. "You just post it, deputy. I will worry about the fire." 3 nights later, the wind was howling through the canyon again, rattling the canvas roof of Eliza's tent. She sat at her small table, the oil lamp turned low. The tin box lay open before her. She had spent hours staring at the documents inside. The handwriting was archaic and flowery, difficult to decipher in the dim light. It was a deed transfer, dated 1869, granting water rights to the holder of this instrument for the entirety of Willow Draw's subterranean flow. It was signed by a corrupt governor who had been ousted years ago, but the legality was murky. The signature of the witness was smudged, illegible, and at the bottom, where the official seal should have been pressed into the wax, there was only a smooth depression. "It is incomplete," Eliza whispered, rubbing her temples. "Without the seal, it is just paper." Outside, Tubey was sitting by the fire pit. He was allowed closer now, within the circle of light, though he still slept in the woods. Eliza picked up the map and walked to the tent flap. She pushed it open. "Tubey." He looked up from whittling a peg. "Come look at this," she said. He hesitated, remembering the rule, but she waved him over. He stopped at the threshold of the tent, leaning in to look at the paper she held against the lantern light. "This map," Eliza said, pointing to the red line. This is the creek, but what is this? She traced the dotted line that snaked up the canyon wall and disappeared into a box canyon to the north. Tubey narrowed his eyes. He made a low sound in his throat. That is not a creek, he said. That is the spirit path. The spirit path. It is a Comanche road, he explained. We used it to move horses through the canyon without being seen from the valley floor. It is hidden by the rock overhangs. It leads to a cave system where the water comes out of the mountain. He looked at Eliza, his eyes sharp. Why does the white man have a map of our secret road? Slade, Eliza breathed. If this map marks a secret route, maybe that is why he wants the land. Not just for the water, but for what he can move through here unseen. Cattle rustling, Tubey said. The realization hit them both. If he moves stolen herds through the spirit path, he bypasses the tax collectors and the brands inspectors on the main road. He is stealing cattle and hiding them here, Eliza said, her blood running cold. That is why he cannot have anyone living in the draw. I would see them. The mystery of the box deepened. Someone had known. Someone had mapped Slade's secret route and prepared the legal weapon to stop him the water rights. But they had hidden it and disappeared. He will kill for this, Tubey said. It was a statement of fact, devoid of emotion. He is trying to kill me with laws first, Eliza said. Deputy Ward came by this morning while you were up on the ridge. He posted a notice. I have 7 days to finish the roof, or I am trespassing. Tubey looked at the half-finished cabin. The walls were up to 7 feet, but the roof required heavy beams, shingles, tar. It was a month of work for 2 men, let alone a woman and 1 Comanche. 7 days, Tubey repeated. Then we work at night. You said, I said I accept your terms, he interrupted. But the terms have changed. The enemy is moving. We must move faster. They did not get the chance to start. 2 nights later, the air in the valley was heavy and still. Eliza was asleep, exhausted from 12 hours of lifting timber. She woke to a sound that was not the wind. It was a crackling, snapping sound, like someone stepping on dry twigs. Then came the smell, acrid, sharp, coal oil. Eliza sat up, her heart hammering. The inside of her tent was glowing with a flickering, orange light. Fire! She scrambled out of her blankets. Grabbing her boots but forgetting her coat, she threw open the tent flap. The world was burning. The stack of seasoned logs, the timber she had spent weeks dragging, peeling, and notching, was a towering inferno. The flames leaped 20 feet into the air, roaring like a living beast. The heat was physical, a punch to the face that singed her eyebrows. No! Eliza screamed. No, no, no! She ran toward the fire. Those logs were her life. They were her home. They were her only defense against the deadline. She grabbed a bucket of water near the fire pit and threw it. The water hissed and vanished instantly into the steam. It was useless. The coal oil had soaked deep into the wood. Save the sill! She cried out, her mind fracturing. If the fire spread to the cabin frame itself, everything was lost. She grabbed a shovel and ran closer, trying to throw dirt onto the flames. The heat was unbearable. Her skin felt like it was blistering. The smoke swirled around her, thick and oily, choking her. She coughed, bending double, her eyes streaming tears. She swung the shovel again, but her head swam. The lack of oxygen, the heat, the sheer panic, it was too much. Her knees buckled. She swayed, stumbling forward toward the wall of fire. Suddenly, a weight slammed into her. Arms wrapped around her waist, strong, undeniable arms. She was lifted off her feet and thrown backward. She landed hard in the snow, the breath knocked out of her. Tubey was there. He did not look at her. He had a wet blanket in his hands, his buffalo robe, soaked in the creek. He ran toward the cabin frame, where the sparks were landing on the dry pine. He beat the flames. He thrashed at the sparks with a fury that matched the fire. He was shouting something in his own language, a war cry against the element that had taken his family. Eliza watched him through the haze. He was a demon of shadow and motion, fighting to save her home. He worked until the main pile collapsed inward, sending a shower of sparks into the sky, but falling away from the cabin. He shoveled snow onto the side of the structure, banking it against the heat. It took an hour for the fire to die down to a sullen, glowing heap of charcoal. The lumber was gone. 80% of her materials destroyed, but the cabin frame, the 4 walls they had built together, stood scorched but safe. Eliza sat in the snow, hugging her knees. She was shaking so violently her teeth chattered. Her face was smeared with soot and tears. She was wearing only her nightdress and boots. Tubé walked over to her. He was panting, his chest heaving. His hands were burned, the skin red and angry. He looked down at her, the woman who had drawn a line in the dirt, the woman who had told him not to touch. She looked up at him, her eyes hollow. "It is gone," she whispered. "The wood is gone. I cannot finish it. They won." Tubé knelt. He did not ask permission. He took the buffalo robe, scorched and smelling of smoke, and wrapped it around her shoulders. The heat from his body was still trapped in the fur. He stayed there, kneeling in the snow, his face inches from hers. "Look at me, Eliza," he commanded. It was the first time he had used her name. She looked. "Wood grows back," he said fiercely. "Trees are many. We are here. The foundation holds." He reached out, his hand hovering for a second. Then he placed his palm on her shoulder, over the blanket. It was a heavy, grounding weight. "They burn because they are afraid," Tubé said. "They are afraid of what you are building." "I am just one woman," she sobbed, the fight finally draining out of her. "I am all alone." Tubé looked at the smoldering ruins, then back at her. His dark eyes softened, the grief in them making space for something else resolve. "You are not alone," he said, his voice as rough as the bark of the trees they had cut. "Not if you allow it." Eliza looked at his hand on her shoulder, then at his face. The smoke swirled around them, but the wind had died. In the silence of the aftermath, with the smell of disaster in the air, she leaned imperceptibly into his touch. "I allow it," she whispered, and for the first time in 5 years, the quiet wind did not pull away. He sat with her in the ashes, watching the dawn begin to bleed gray into the eastern sky. The church bell of Red Mesa tolled with a flat, iron note that seemed to bruise the cold Sunday morning air. It was a sound meant to gather the flock, but to Eliza May Carver, walking the frozen mile from the livery stable to the white-clapboard building, it sounded like a gavel striking a judge's bench. She did not want to be here. Her hands were raw and blistered from clearing the charred remains of her lumber pile. Her dress, though clean and pressed, was 3 years out of fashion and darned at the elbows. But she walked with her spine straight, her chin held high. To hide was to admit guilt, and she was guilty of nothing but survival. As she ascended the wooden steps, the chatter in the vestibule died instantly. It was a physical sensation, the silence. It pressed against her skin. 20 faces turned. Men in stiff Sunday collars looked at their boots or over her head. Women adjusted their shawls and pulled their children closer, as if Eliza carried a contagion. Clara Pike stood near the door, flanked by a circle of town matrons. Clara was wearing a new velvet hat, the color of a bruised plum. Her eyes raked over Eliza, lingering on the rough, red skin of Eliza's hands. "I see you are still here, Mrs. Carver," Clara said. Her voice was sweet, the kind of sweetness that masked a bitter poison. "We heard about the fire. A terrible shame. But perhaps it is a sign." "A sign of what, Mrs. Pike?" Eliza asked, her voice calm despite the thumping of her heart. "That some places are not meant to be tamed by a woman alone," Clara said, raising her voice slightly so the nearby men could hear. "Especially a woman who keeps wild company. The Bible tells us not to yoke ourselves to unbelievers. Mrs. Carver, it invites darkness." "The only darkness at Willow Draw," Eliza replied, "is the man who lit the match." A gasp went through the circle. Vernon Slade, standing near the donation box, turned slowly. He smiled, a tight, cold expression. "Careful, Eliza," Slade said. "Accusations without proof are slander. And slander is a sin, is it not, Reverend?" Eliza did not wait for the Reverend's answer. She walked past them, down the center aisle, and took a seat in the back pew. She sat alone. A radius of 3 empty feet separated her from the rest of the congregation. Outside, 500 yards away in the tree line, Tubei watched. He did not understand the white man's religion. They built a box to hold their god, then stood outside it to speak ill of their neighbors. He saw Eliza enter the box. He saw the way the others recoiled, like a herd of buffalo shying away from a sick calf. He gripped his rifle. The urge to ride down there, to shatter their windows and their quiet malice, was a heat in his blood. But he knew that was what the wolf Slade wanted. Violence would only justify their hate. So he stood his ground, a silent sentinel in the snow, waiting for her to survive the hour. 2 days later, the trap was sprung. It happened at the Red Mesa General Store. A clerk ran into the street, shouting that he had been robbed. He claimed a man with braided hair and a buffalo robe had ridden up, put a knife to his throat, and taken a box of ammunition and a sack of flour. It was a clumsy lie. Tubei had plenty of ammunition, and he did not eat white flour. But truth was not the currency of Red Mesa. Fear was. Within the hour, Vernon Slade was in the office of Deputy Ezekiel Ward. Ezekiel was a mountain of a man, his skin the color of deep mahogany. He was sharpening a plowshare on a whetstone, the rhythmic shh sound filling the small room. He had been a sergeant in the 10th Cavalry, a buffalo soldier who had fought the Apache and the Comanche across the plains. He knew the difference between a war party and a lie. "You want me to form a posse, Mr. Slade?" Ezekiel asked, not looking up from the blade. "I want you to do your job." "Deputy," Slade said, leaning against the doorframe, "a citizen was robbed. The description matches the stray buck that hangs around the Carver place. He is dangerous. He is a renegade." "The clerk said he took flour," Ezekiel said, testing the edge of the steel with his thumb. "Comanche do not steal flour. They steal horses. They steal guns." This sounds like a story a frightened boy tells to cover a mistake in the ledger. Slade's face hardened. "It sounds like you are hesitating." "Ezekiel, I hold the note on this forge. I hold the note on the tools you are using right now. The town pays your salary as deputy. But I sign the checks." Ezekiel stopped sharpening. He looked up, his eyes weary and hard. He owed Slade $400. It was a debt that felt heavier than the anvil in the corner. "I will ride out," Ezekiel said slowly. "I will investigate, but I will not hunt a man down for a sack of flour unless I see the tracks myself. While you are out there," Slade added, pulling a folded paper from his coat pocket, "serve this. The town council met this morning. We are invoking the Public Safety Clause of the Homestead Act. The structure at Willow Draw is a fire hazard and an attraction for hostile elements." He tossed the paper onto the anvil. "She has 2 weeks, Ezekiel 14 days. If that cabin does not have a sealed roof, a hung door, and glass in the window, the claim is void. You will evict her on the 15th day." Ezekiel looked at the paper. It was a death sentence for the farm, and Slade knew it. "She cannot build a roof in 2 weeks in this weather," Ezekiel said. "Not alone." "Then she should have thought of that before she decided to play pioneer," Slade said, turning to leave. "Serve the paper, deputy, or I will find a man who will." While the town wove its net of laws and lies, Tubei was reading the earth. He had found the tracks of the men who had burned the lumber. They were careless, confident men. Their horses were shod with heavy iron. He tracked them not back to town, but north, toward the jagged canyon walls that bordered the upper reach of Willow Draw. He followed them to the spot marked on Eliza's map, the dotted line. The terrain here was treacherous, a maze of limestone boulders and scrub cedar. But there was a trail. It was old, worn deep into the stone by centuries of unshod pony hooves, now overlaid with the fresh prints of iron shoes. Tubei dismounted and led his paint horse, moving like smoke through the brush. He smelled them before he saw them. Cattle, hundreds of them. The scent of manure and bovine sweat was thick in the cold air. He crested a ridge and looked down. Hidden in a box canyon, invisible from the main valley, was a holding pen made of rope and natural rock walls. Inside were at least 200 head of longhorn cattle. Tubey lay flat on his stomach, pulling a brass spyglass from his pouch. He focused on the animals. They were branded, but the brands were fresh. A clumsy, running iron bar had been seared over the original marks. He adjusted the glass, scanning the far side of the pen. There, the canyon wall seemed to split. A dark fissure, masked by an overhang of rock, led into the mountain. A stream of water flowed out of it, the source of Willow Draw. This was the secret. Slade was not just grazing cattle. He was stealing them from the southern herds, driving them up the old Comanche Spirit Trail, rebranding them in this hidden canyon, and then pushing them out to the northern markets as his own. And Eliza's land sat right at the mouth of the bottleneck. If she stayed, she would eventually see the drive. She was the cork in the bottle of Slade's criminal empire. Tubey lowered the glass. A cold anger settled in his gut. They had burned her wood not just to stop a house, but to hide a theft of thousands of dollars. He slipped back down the ridge. He had to tell her. But more than that, he realized with a jolt of clarity, he had to fight for her. The storm that night was a living thing. It was a norther, a blue whizzer that dropped the temperature to 0 and turned the air into a knife blade. Eliza was inside the cabin shell. Since the fire, she had moved the tent inside the 4 walls for protection, but the lack of a roof made it little better than sleeping in the open. The wind swirled over the top logs, creating a vortex of snow inside the room. She was huddled under 3 blankets, shivering so violently her muscles cramped. The cold was a physical weight, pressing the life out of her. "Eliza!" The voice came from the darkness. She tried to sit up, but her body was stiff. Tubey was there. He did not ask permission this time. He stepped over the logs, carrying an armload of dry cedar wood he had kept dry under his own robes. He knelt by the small fire pit she had dug in the corner. The coals were dead. "Do not move," he commanded. He worked quickly, striking flint to steel, nursing a spark into tinder. Within minutes, a fire crackled, the cedar snapping and popping. He fed it carefully, building a heat that began to push back the freezing dark. He turned to her. She was blue-lipped, her eyes glassy. Hypothermia was setting in. Tubey cursed in his own tongue. He moved to her, pulling the blankets back. "No," Eliza mumbled, her teeth chattering. "The rules, the distance." "The rules will kill you tonight," he said roughly. He sat down behind her, pulling her back against his chest. He wrapped his heavy buffalo robe around both of them, creating a cocoon of fur and wool. He was a furnace. His body heat was immense, radiating through his buckskin shirt into her frozen spine. Eliza stiffened for a moment, panic warring with instinct, but the warmth was overwhelming. It was life. She slumped against him, her head falling back onto his shoulder. They sat like that for a long time, the fire casting long, dancing shadows on the walls that had no roof. Outside, the wind screamed, furious that it could not reach them. Eliza's shivering began to subside. She looked down at his hands, which were clasped over the blanket in front of her. They were large hands, scarred and calloused. On the back of his left hand, a jagged white line ran from his knuckles to his wrist. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and traced the scar. "The army?" she asked. Her voice was a whisper, barely audible. Tubey did not pull away. He watched her hand on his skin, her pale, work-worn fingers against his copper tone. "No," he said. His voice rumbled in his chest, vibrating against her back. "I did this to myself, the day I buried my son. In my culture, we cut ourselves to let the grief out. If we do not, the grief poisons the blood." Eliza stopped moving her hand. She left it resting on his. "I have no scars like that," she said softly. "But I think I am poisoned inside. I ran away. Tubey, I did not come here just for land. I ran because I was afraid of becoming nothing. And now, I am terrified that I have dragged you into a war that is not yours." She turned her head slightly, trying to see his face in the firelight. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you stay? You could go north. You could find your people." Why freeze in this valley for a woman who cannot even hammer a nail straight? Tubei looked down at her. His face was inches from hers. She could smell the wood smoke in his hair, the scent of pine and sage. "I stay," he said, and his voice was devoid of the stoicism he wore like armor. "Because for 5 years I have looked at the world and felt nothing. I was a ghost haunting my own life. But when I watch you, when I see you fight the earth, and the wind, and the men of that town—" He paused, his thumb brushing the fabric of the blanket near her neck. "You make me remember what it is to be alive," he said. "I look at you, Eliza, because you are doing what I did not do. When the sickness came, I gave up. I let the fire go out. You keep lighting it, no matter how much snow falls." The intimacy of the moment was thick, heavier than the blankets. It was not the heat of lust, though the connection was physical and intense. It was the heat of recognition. Two broken things finding that their jagged edges fit together. Eliza turned in his arms, shifting so she could look him fully in the face. She reached up and touched his cheek, her thumb grazing the high bone. "I am scared," she admitted, tears pricking her eyes. "I have 2 weeks. They gave me a paper. If the roof is not on, then we will put the roof on," Tubei said firmly. He covered her hand with his, pressing it to his face for a brief second before pulling it down. "Sleep now. I will watch the fire." He did not leave. He held her through the night, a human wall against the cold. And for the first time in her life, Eliza slept without dreaming of running. The peace of the storm did not last. 2 nights later, the sky was clear, but the moon was hidden. Eliza and Tubei were working by lantern light, a violation of her old rules, but necessary now. They were cutting notches in the heavy oak beams Tubei had dragged down from the high ridge. The sound of hooves broke the rhythm of the saw. 4 men rode into the clearing. They were not lawmen. They were drunks, hired hands from the saloon, reeking of cheap whiskey and false bravado. Slade's intimidation squad. "Hey!" one of them shouted, swaying in his saddle. "Slade says, 'Get out, burn the witch!'" He pulled a pistol and fired a shot into the air. The report cracked like a whip. Barnaby the mule brayed in terror. "Looky there!" another yelled, pointing at Tubei, who stood in the shadows near the woodpile. "It's the buck I told you he was humping her." Eliza dropped her saw and reached for the Colt on the table. "No," Tubei said. His voice was not a shout, but it cut through the noise like a blade. He stepped into the light. He held no gun. He held only a long, heavy piece of oak, a handle for an axe he had been shaping. "Get him, boys!" the leader shouted. Spurring his horse forward, the horse charged. Tubei did not run. He waited until the animal was 10 feet away. Then he moved. He stepped to the side, a motion so fast it blurred. He swung the oak staff, not at the rider, but at the horse's nose, a controlled tap. Just enough to startle. The horse shied violently to the left. The drunk rider, loose in the saddle, flew off the right side and landed face first in the half-frozen mud. The other 3 hesitated. Tubei did not wait. He dropped the staff and sprinted at the second rider. He grabbed the man's belt and yanked him down. The man hit the ground with a wheeze. Tubei kicked the pistol from his hand before it could clear the holster. The remaining 2 panicked. They tried to turn their horses, but the animals were confused by the shadows and the sudden violence. Tubei grabbed the bridle of the 3rd horse, looking the rider in the eye. The Comanche let out a sound, a sharp, piercing war cry that he had not used since the days of the raids on the Pecos. The rider's courage evaporated. He kicked his horse, nearly trampling his friend on the ground, and bolted into the dark. The 4th followed. Tubei stood over the 2 men in the mud. They groaned, trying to rise. Tubei pulled his knife. The metal glinted in the lantern light. The men froze, their eyes wide with terror. Tubei crouched. With 2 swift movements, he sliced their gun belts, cutting the leather so the holsters fell into the dirt. He picked up their pistols. "Walk," Tubei said. He pointed toward Red Mesa with the knife. "Walk back. Tell Slade that the next time he sends children to do a man's job, I will send them back without their boots." The men scrambled up. slipping in the mud, and ran into the darkness, leaving their horses behind. Eliza stood by the cabin wall, the Colt heavy in her hand. Her heart was racing. She had expected a shootout. She had expected blood. Instead, she had seen a master at work. He had dismantled them without firing a shot. He had humiliated them. Tubey turned to her. He was breathing hard, the adrenaline illuminating his face. He looked dangerous. He looked alive. He walked over to the table and set the captured pistols down. "They will be back," he said, "and next time, they will not be drunk." Eliza looked at the guns, then at the unfinished roof beams. "We cannot finish this in time," she said, the reality hitting her. "Even working nights. It is too much lumber, too much weight." "Then we do not just build," Tubey said. "We fight." "How?" Eliza asked. "We are two people against a town." "No," Tubey corrected her. He looked north, toward the hidden canyon. "We are two people with a secret. Slade is hiding cattle. You have the paper that controls the water. It is time to stop digging a hole." "Eliza," he looked her in the eye, the firelight reflecting in his dark pupils. "It is time to hunt the wolf." Eliza looked at the man who had warmed her with his own body, the man who had just defended her with his bare hands. She realized that the line she had drawn in the dirt weeks ago was gone. The wind had blown it away. "I will not run," Eliza said, her voice finding a steel core she didn't know it possessed. "If we go down, Tubey, we go down standing." "Good," he said. He picked up the axe handle. "Then let us put up the main beam. We have a roof to raise before the war begins." Together, under the cold, in different stars, they lifted the heavy timber. It groaned as it rose, settling into the notches with a final, solid thud. It was only one beam, but it was the spine of the house. And as they stood there, shoulder to shoulder, their breath mingling in the frozen air, it felt like the spine of something much stronger. The 15th day dawned with a sky the color of a bruised plum. The wind had died down, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the storm. It was the silence of a held breath before the executioner drops the blade. Eliza May Carver rode Barnaby into Red Mesa at noon. She wore her best dress, the dark gray wool she had worn to her husband's funeral, and she had scrubbed the pine pitch from her hands until her skin was raw. She carried her head high, but inside, her stomach was a knot of cold dread. In her saddlebag lay the tin box. It was her shield. It was the only weapon she had left against the men who wanted to erase her. The town square was not a square at all, but a patch of frozen mud between the hotel and the livery stable. Today, however, it had been transformed into a theater of judgment. A long table had been dragged out onto the porch of the hotel. Behind it sat the town council, the mayor, the banker, and a man Eliza did not know, the district land proxy. Standing to the side, leaning against a support post with the casual arrogance of a man who has already read the script, was Vernon Slade. A crowd had gathered. It seemed the entire population of Red Mesa had turned out to watch the widow Carver be put in her place. Eliza dismounted. She tied Barnaby to the rail. No one moved to help her. She walked to the center of the mud, feeling 500 pairs of eyes on her back. "Mrs. Carver," the mayor began, clearing his throat. He was a small, nervous man who owed too much money to the bank. "We are gathered here to adjudicate the claim on the Willow Draw parcel. It has been brought to our attention that the terms of the Homestead Act have not been met. The deadline is today," Eliza said, her voice clear. "The day is not over." "The deadline is for a habitable dwelling," the unknown man, the proxy, said. He had a voice like dry paper. "I rode out there this morning, Mrs. Carver. I saw 4 walls and a beam. I saw no roof. I saw no door. I saw a tent pitched inside a ruin." "It is not a ruin," Eliza argued. Stepping forward, "It is a work in progress. The materials were destroyed by arson. A fire set by men who answered to Mr. Slade." Slade pushed himself off the post. "Careful now," he warned, his voice smooth. "We are here to talk about your failures, Eliza, not your fantasies. And we are here to talk about safety. Clara Pike cut in. She stood on the stairs, elevated above the crowd. It is not just about the roof, is it? It is about the company she keeps. A woman alone out there, consorting with savages. It is a danger to the whole territory. Slade nodded to the crowd. Bring them out. 2 men stepped forward. They were the drunks from the other night, the ones Tubey had humiliated. They looked sober now, their hats in their hands, their faces masks of feigned piety. Tell the council what you saw, Slade commanded. We was just riding by, one of them lied, refusing to look at Eliza. Checking on a stray calf, and out comes this Comanche buck. He had a knife. He threatened to scalp us if we didn't leave Mrs. Carver alone. Said she belonged to him. A murmur of outrage rippled through the crowd. He lives there, Clara Pike said, her voice rising to a shriek. She feeds him. She shelters him. A Christian woman, laying with a heathen who likely has the blood of our kin on his hands. It is unnatural. It is obscene. Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. That is a lie. He saved me from wolves. He helped me lift timber when this town would not sell me a single nail. And where is he now? Slade asked, looking around. Where is this noble protector? The crowd turned. At the far edge of the square, where the alleyway met the open street, a figure stood. It was Tubey. He was wrapped in his buffalo robe, his face shadowed by the brim of a battered hat he had acquired. He stood perfectly still, his hands visible, hanging at his sides. He carried no rifle. He had come, as he said he would, to watch the wolf. The reaction was instantaneous. Women screamed. Men grabbed the handles of their pistols. The murmur turned into a low, threatening growl. There he is, someone shouted. The renegade! Eliza turned. Her heart leaped. He had come. He was here. She looked at him across the 50 yards of frozen mud. Her eyes pleaded with him. Step forward, she begged silently. Tell them you are not a monster. Tell them we are building a home, not a war camp. Defend me. Tubey saw her look. He saw the desperation in her eyes, but he also saw the men on the rooftops. He saw the deputy, Ezekiel Ward, standing with his hand hovering over his gun. He saw the twitchy fingers of the drunk Slade had hired. He knew the calculus of violence. If he stepped forward, if he spoke, if he made one aggressive move, they would kill him, and in the crossfire, they might kill her. So he did nothing. He stood like a statue of stone, his face impassive, his eyes locked on the horizon. He swallowed the words he wanted to say. He swallowed his pride. He chose survival. But Eliza did not see the calculation. She saw only the silence. She watched him for 10 agonizing seconds. He did not move. He did not speak. He let them call him a monster. And by extension, he let them call her a whore. Something broke inside Eliza's chest. It was a sharp, brittle snap, louder than the wind. He was just like the rest of them. When the pressure came, when the cost was high, he chose himself. He was just a shadow on a hill, willing to watch but not to bleed. Eliza turned her back on him. The cold that washed over her was absolute. I do not need him to speak for me, Eliza said. Her voice was different now. It was hard. It lacked the tremor of fear. And I do not need your pity. She walked up the steps to the porch, stopping directly in front of the table. She slammed the tin box down on the wood. The sound silenced the crowd. You say I have no claim, Eliza said, opening the lid. You say the land is forfeit because of a roof. But the Homestead Act has a clause, does it not? Section 4, Paragraph 2. In the event of disputed water resources, the claimant holds right of possession until the dispute is settled. She pulled out the yellowed papers. This is the original survey of Willow Draw, she announced, holding it up. And this is the deed granting sole water rights to the holder of this instrument. Vernon Slade has been trying to drive me off because he wants the water. But the water belongs to this box. She slapped the paper onto the table in front of the proxy. The water is mine, and as long as the water is in dispute, you cannot evict me. That is the law. The proxy picked up the paper. He adjusted his spectacles. He looked at the map, then at the deed. He paled slightly. This This appears to be a legitimate territorial grant, the proxy stammered. Dated 1869. Slade did not flinch. He walked over to the table and looked down at the paper. He smiled. A slow, terrible spreading of lips that showed his teeth. It is a fine document. Eliza, Slade said. Beautiful handwriting. But tell me, Mr. Proxy, what makes a territorial deed valid? The signature of the governor, the proxy said, and the great seal of the territory, pressed in wax. Look at the bottom, Slade commanded. Eliza felt a sudden chill. She looked at the bottom of the page. There was the red wax, but it was smooth. There was no impression, no eagle, no shield. It is blank, the proxy said. It is unfinished, Slade corrected. Just like her cabin, just like her life. Slade reached into his own coat pocket. He pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in velvet. He unwrapped it slowly. It was a heavy brass seal, the matrix of the great seal of the territory. The governor was a careless man, Slade said, tossing the brass seal onto the table next to the paper. It landed with a heavy thunk. He lost this in a poker game 5 years ago. I kept it as a souvenir, without the impression of this seal. That paper is just kindling. Eliza stared at the brass object, the missing piece, the final nail in her coffin. The box had been buried because it was incomplete, hidden by someone who had failed, just like her. So, Slade said, turning to the crowd, she has no roof, she has no water rights. She is squatting on public land, harboring a hostile savage, and waving forged documents. He looked at Ezekiel Ward. Deputy, Slade said, arrest her for fraud and seize the land. The crowd erupted. Lock her up, someone shouted. Ezekiel Ward stepped forward. His face was pained. Mrs. Carver, he began. No, Eliza shouted. She backed away, her hand going to the Colt at her waist. This is a trap. He stole that seal. He's got a gun. One of the drunks yelled the same man who had lost his pistol to Toubé. It was a lie. Toubé had not moved. But the drunk wanted revenge. He pulled a hidden derringer from his boot and leveled it. Not at Eliza, but at the silent Comanche at the edge of the square. Die, you red devil. The crack of the gunshot was small, but it shattered the world. The bullet went wild, missing Toubé and splintering the wood of a hitching post near a group of women. Panic exploded. Horses reared. People screamed and dove for cover. In the chaos, Vernon Slade saw his chance. He nodded to his other man, a gunman positioned on the hotel balcony. The gunman raised a rifle. He aimed at Toubé, but Toubé was no longer a statue. At the sound of the first shot, the paralysis of survival broke. He saw the rifleman on the balcony. He saw Eliza standing exposed on the steps, frozen in shock. He did not run for the alley. He did not return fire. He sprinted. He moved with the speed of a striking snake, covering the distance to the porch in 3 seconds. As the rifle on the balcony flashed, Toubé launched himself up the stairs. He did not tackle the gunman. He tackled Eliza. He slammed into her, wrapping his arms around her and spinning her around, throwing his own body between her and the line of fire. Thwack! The sound of the bullet hitting flesh was sickeningly wet. Toubé grunted, a sharp expulsion of air against Eliza's ear. They crashed to the floor of the porch, sliding across the wood. Toubé landed on top of her, his heavy weight pinning her down. Shielding her head with his hand. "Hold fire!" Ezekiel Ward bellowed. His voice was a cannon blast that overrode the panic. "Damn it! Hold fire!" The deputy had his own peacemaker drawn now, and he leveled it not at the Comanche, but at the balcony. "Drop it!" Ezekiel roared at Slade's gunman. "Drop it or you die!" The gunman hesitated, then lowered the rifle. Silence rushed back into the square. Sudden and ringing. Eliza lay on the hard wood, the smell of dust and floor polish in her nose. Above her, Toubé was heavy and still. "Toubé," she whispered. He pushed himself up slowly. His face was gray, his teeth clenched in a rictus of pain. Blood was blooming on the shoulder of his buffalo robe, a dark, spreading stain. He looked down at her. His eyes were not the eyes of a savage. They were the eyes of a man who had made his choice. "Are you whole?" he rasped. Eliza stared at him. The crowd stared at them. The narrative had broken. The monster had not attacked. The savage had not taken a scalp. He had taken a bullet meant for a white woman. Vernon Slade stood by the post, his face twisting in fury. He knew, in that second, that he had lost the crowd. He could frighten them, he could buy them, but he could not undo what they had just seen. Ezekiel Ward walked up the steps. He looked at Slade, then at the wounded Comanche. "This hearing is over," Ezekiel said. His voice was final. "There will be no arrests today." "She is a fraud," Slade spat. That land is under investigation," Ezekiel interrupted, turning his badge toward Slade. "By me. And until I finish my investigation, anyone who sets foot on Willow Draw answers to the United States Army. Is that clear? Vernon." Slade looked at the deputy, then at the silent, watching town. He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the steps, inches from Eliza's boot. "Winter is long, deputy," Slade said softly. "And wounds fester." He turned and walked away, his spurs jingling in the quiet. Eliza scrambled out from under Tubay. She tried to touch his shoulder, to staunch the blood. But he pulled back. He stood up, swaying slightly. "You are hurt," she said, reaching for him. "It is through the meat," Tubay said. He pressed his hand over the hole in his robe. "It will keep." He looked at her, waiting for the acknowledgement, waiting for her to understand why he had waited and why he had moved. But Eliza was shaking. The adrenaline was crashing, and with it came the cold clarity of what had just happened. She looked at the blood on his hand, then at the terrified faces of the townspeople. He had saved her life, but he had almost waited too long, and now he was bleeding because of her. "Come," she said, her voice trembling. "We need to get you to the doctor." "No," Tubay said. "No white medicine." He turned to leave, to head back toward the wildness of the ridge. "Stop," Eliza said. She stood up. She did not look at the crowd. She did not look at Clara Pike, whose mouth was hanging open. She looked only at him. "You do not get to walk away," she said fiercely. "You do not get to save me and then disappear to bleed alone on a rock." She walked over to Barnaby and untied the reins. She led the mule to the steps. "Get on the mule," she commanded. Tubay looked at her. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had made her drag logs until her hands bled. "I can walk," he said. "Get on the mule," she repeated. "I am not asking." She turned to the crowd. Her gaze swept over them, the mayor, the proxy, the women who had shunned her. "Go home," she told them. "The show is over." She mounted her horse, grabbed Barnaby's lead rope, and waited until Tubay, gripping the pommel with white knuckles, pulled himself onto the mule. She rode out of Red Mesa without looking back, but as they hit the open trail, the wind biting at their faces, she spoke to him without turning her head. "You waited," she said. It was an accusation. "I calculated," he replied, his voice tight with pain. "I do not need a mathematician," Eliza said, the tears finally spilling over onto her cold cheeks. "And I do not need a martyr. I need a person. Tubay. I need someone who is here, not a shadow on the hill. I am here," he said quietly. "You are bleeding," she snapped. "That is how you know I am real," he answered. They rode in silence toward the darkening canyon, the blood from his shoulder leaving a trail of bright red drops on the white snow, marking the path home. The silence between them was louder than the gunshot that had wounded him. Eliza May Carver stood on the roof of her cabin, balancing precariously on the rough-hewn top plate. The wind whipped her skirts around her legs, threatening to pull her down into the frozen mud below. She held a heavy cedar shingle in one hand and a hammer in the other. Bang! The nail went in crooked. Bang! She struck her thumb. Eliza bit her lip until she tasted copper, refusing to cry out. It had been 2 days since the scene in the town square, 2 days since Tubay had taken a bullet for her, and 2 days since she had brought him back to the valley, cleaned his wound with boiled water and whiskey, and watched him retreat into the woods like a wounded animal seeking a dark hole. She was alone again. The deadline was 48 hours away. The roof was a skeleton of ribs with no skin. She looked at her hands. They were swollen, the knuckles raw and bleeding from the cold and the rough wood. She was failing, despite the gun, despite the deed, despite the bravado on the steps of the hotel. She was going to lose because she simply did not have enough strength in her arms to beat the winter. "Damn you," she whispered, looking at the empty tree line where he usually stood. "Damn you for making me believe I had a partner." Tubey sat by the river, 3 miles upstream. He was naked from the waist up, shivering slightly as he washed the dressing on his shoulder. The bullet had passed through the muscle of his deltoid, missing the bone but leaving a messy, angry channel that burned like a coal. He applied a poultice of chewed sage and spiderwebs to the wound, binding it tight with a strip of clean cloth. The physical pain was manageable. It was a dull roar he could ignore. The noise in his head was harder to silence. He closed his eyes and summoned her face. Not Eliza's, mourning doves. Usually, when he thought of his wife, he saw her dying. He saw the smallpox sores and the gray pallor of death. But today, the vision was different. He saw her as she had been the day he left for a hunt, a week before the sickness came. She was standing by the lodge entrance, holding their son. She was laughing at him because he had tripped over a tent peg. "You look at the horizon so much, quiet wind," she had teased, "that you forget where your feet are." Tubey opened his eyes. The river rushed by, dark and cold. He had spent 5 years looking at the horizon, looking at the past, looking at the ghosts. He had become a watcher, a spirit that haunted the ridges but touched nothing. He had told himself it was penance. He had told himself it was survival. But Eliza was right. It was cowardice. He had hesitated on the edge of the square because he was afraid of losing again. He had tried to protect his heart by keeping it in a stone box, just like the deed to the water. "To survive is to stay in the winter," he said aloud to the rushing water. "To live is to build the fire." He stood up. The movement pulled at his wound, sending a spike of agony down his arm. He welcomed it. It was a reminder that he was still made of meat and blood. Not smoke. He reached for his shirt. He had work to do. But first, he needed a weapon that was not a knife. The forge of Red Mesa was dark, save for the glow of the banked coals in the center of the room. Ezekiel Ward sat on his anvil, a bottle of whiskey in his hand. He had not opened it. He was staring at the badge pinned to his vest. Deputy, it was a piece of tin. It meant nothing if the man wearing it was hollow. The door to the smithy creaked open. Ezekiel did not reach for his gun. He knew who it was. The man moved with a silence that displaced the air rather than disturbed it. "You are late," Ezekiel said, his voice rumbling in the gloom. Tubey stepped into the red glow of the coals. He looked different tonight. The buffalo robe was gone, replaced by a heavy wool coat he must have scavenged. His face was sharp. The hesitation of the last few weeks burned away. "I had to dress my wound." Tubey said, "How is it?" "It holds." Tubey looked at the bottle in Ezekiel's hand. "Are you drunk?" "Blacksmith. Thinking about it," Ezekiel admitted. He set the bottle down on the dirt floor. "I posted the notice. Tubey, I had to. The law says if she is not finished by Friday." "The law is a piece of paper," Tubey said. "And the paper is missing a seal." Ezekiel sighed, a sound like a bellows collapsing. "Slade has it. He flashed it in the square. He keeps it in the big safe at his ranch house. The Box S is a fortress. He has 6 men riding perimeter and 2 sleeping on the porch." "He does not have 6 men," Tubey corrected. "He has 4. 2 of them are currently walking with a limp because they lost their horses in the dark." Ezekiel looked at the Comanche. He saw the glint in the dark eyes, a spark of the warrior who had once ridden the plains as a lord of the grass. "You are planning to go in there," Ezekiel said. It was not a question. "The woman needs the seal to prove the deed." Tubey said, "But she needs more than that. She needs the truth about the water. If Slade is stealing cattle, he is keeping records. A man like that writes down every dollar, even the stolen ones." "It is suicide," Ezekiel said. "If you get caught, they will hang you without a trial. I do not plan to get caught." Tubey looked at the massive arms of the blacksmith. "But I cannot carry a 300-pound safe, and I cannot read the white man's ledgers." Ezekiel looked at his hands. They were black with soot and hard as iron. He had spent 10 years trying to be invisible, trying to be a good one, so the town would let him exist. And what had it gotten him? A debt he could not pay, and the job of evicting a widow. He stood up. He unpinned the tin star from his chest and set it on the anvil next to his hammer. "I am not going as a deputy," Ezekiel said, picking up a heavy iron pry bar from his workbench. "Tonight, I'm just a man who hates a bully." The Box S Ranch lay 4 miles south of town, a sprawling compound of corrals and a large main house that sat on a rise overlooking the valley. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. The moon was obscured by heavy clouds. Tubey moved through the paddock like a shadow. He approached the first guard, a man leaning against the fence post, dozing. Tubey did not use his knife. He used the sleeper hold, clamping his arm around the man's windpipe, cutting off the blood to the brain. The man slumped unconscious without a sound. Tubey lowered him gently to the ground and tied his hands with rawhide. He signaled to the darkness. Ezekiel moved forward. For a big man, he was surprisingly quiet. They reached the back porch of the main house. "The study is on the east corner," Ezekiel whispered. "The safe is in there." The window was locked. Tubey slid a thin blade between the sash and the sill, popping the latch with a soft click. They slipped inside. The room smelled of cigar smoke and expensive brandy. The heavy iron safe stood in the corner. "Can you crack it?" Tubey asked. "I do not need to crack it," Ezekiel whispered, hefting the pry bar. "I built the hinges for this thing 3 years ago. Slade wanted them reinforced, but he used cheap bolts to save money." Ezekiel wedged the tip of the bar into the gap of the upper hinge. He braced his massive legs and pushed. The veins in his neck bulged. There was a groan of metal, a pop, and the hinge sheared off. He repeated the move on the bottom hinge. The heavy door sagged, held only by the locking bolts. Ezekiel gripped the handle and pulled the entire door frame away from the box, laying it quietly on the rug. Tubey reached inside. "The seal," he whispered, pulling out the heavy brass matrix. He handed it to Ezekiel. He reached in again and pulled out a thick, leather-bound book. He opened it. Even in the dim light, the columns of numbers were clear. "Received 50 head, Circle Bar brand, altered to Box S, date November 12th. He wrote it all down, Tubey said. "Arrogant." Suddenly, a floorboard creaked in the hallway. Both men froze. "Who is in there?" Slade's voice, sleepy but suspicious. The door handle turned. Ezekiel did not hesitate. He grabbed a heavy crystal decanter from the desk and hurled it at the far window. Crash! The glass shattered. Slade kicked the door open, a shotgun in his hands. He fired blindly at the broken window. Boom! "Run!" Ezekiel shouted. But he didn't run. He grabbed the heavy safe door from the floor and heaved it like a shield, charging at Slade. Slade tried to reload, but the massive iron plate slammed into him, pinning him against the doorframe. He went down with a wheeze. The wind knocked out of him. Tubey vaulted over the desk, the ledger tucked into his shirt, the seal in his pocket. He grabbed Ezekiel's arm. "Go!" They bolted out the back door as the shouts of the bunkhouse men erupted in the yard. Bullets whined past them, biting into the dirt. But they were already in the trees, vanishing into the night that Tubey knew better than any white man. Eliza was asleep, curled up in the corner of the roofless cabin under a pile of canvas. She woke to the sound of something heavy hitting the wooden table. She sat up, grabbing the Colt. It was dawn. The gray light filtered through the open beams of the roof. Tubey was standing there. He looked exhausted. His face was pale, and fresh blood had seeped through the bandage on his shoulder, staining his coat. But his eyes were clear. On the table sat the brass seal of the territory. Next to it lay a thick ledger. "What?" Eliza stammered, lowering the gun. "The seal," Tubey said. He pointed to the book. "And the proof. Slade has been stealing cattle. It is all in there." Eliza stared at the objects. They were the keys to her freedom, They were the end of the fear. She looked up at him. "You went back. You could have died." "I told you," Tubei said, his voice steady. "I chose fear once. I came to choose again." He stood there, waiting. Perhaps he expected her to run to him, to embrace him, to thank him for saving her a second time. Eliza stood up. She walked over to him. She looked at his wounded shoulder, then up into his face. She did not hug him. Her face was set in a line of hard determination. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a handful of the black iron nails. She grabbed his good hand, the right one, and slapped the nails into his palm. "I do not want your apology," Eliza said, her voice fierce. "And I do not want your blood. I want my roof." She pointed to the ladder leaning against the wall. "If you are here, Tubei, then be here. Put the nails in the wood. Prove to me that you are not just passing through." Tubei looked at the nails in his hand. He looked at the woman who stood before him, not as a damsel to be rescued, but as a commander demanding his allegiance. A slow smile broke across his face. It was the first time she had ever seen him truly smile. It transformed him, taking 10 years off his age. "As you command," he said. He climbed the ladder. The sound of the hammer began. Bang, bang, bang. It was a rhythm, a heartbeat. 2 hours later, another sound joined it, the rumble of a wagon. Eliza looked up from where she was sawing shingles. Ezekiel Ward was driving a buckboard into the clearing, but he was not alone. Sitting next to him was the town midwife, a stern woman named Mrs. Galloway. In the back of the wagon were 2 young men brothers from the Miller farm and the owner of the livery stable. Ezekiel jumped down. He was wearing his badge again, polished to a shine. "Morning, Mrs. Carver," Ezekiel said, tipping his hat. "I brought some friends. We heard there was a roof raising." I cannot pay you," Eliza said, stunned. "We do not want pay." "Mrs., Galloway said, climbing down with a basket of food. "We want to sleep at night. I am tired of letting Vernon Slade decide who is good and who is bad in this town. If Ezekiel says you are good folks, that is enough for me." The Miller brothers were already unloading tools. They looked up at the roof, where Tubei was nailing a shingle. They hesitated for a second, seeing the Comanche. Tubei stopped hammering. He looked down at them. He nodded. Once. The Miller brothers looked at each other, then nodded back. They grabbed a bundle of shingles and climbed the ladder. By noon, there were 10 people in the clearing. The sound of hammers was a thunder that rolled down the valley. Clara Pike arrived in her buggy around 2 o'clock. She stood on the edge of the clearing, her face purple with rage. "This is an abomination," she screamed over the noise. "You are helping a harlot and a savage. You are turning against your own kind." "Mrs." Galloway walked over to Clara. She wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron. "Go home, Clara," the midwife said calmly. "Eliza is building a home. You are just making noise. And frankly, dear, your voice is giving us all a headache." Clara sputtered, looked around for support, and found none. Even the liveryman, usually the biggest gossip, turned his back to her and continued to stir the pot of boiling tar. Clara turned her buggy around and left, her influence dissolving like mist in the sun. The sun was setting on the final day. The last shingle was nailed into place. The crowd had gone quiet. They stood in the clearing, watching the road. Vernon Slade was coming. He rode in with 4 men. He looked battered. His arm was in a sling, and his face was bruised from the impact of the safe door. But his eyes were murderous. He pulled up his horse 10 yards from the cabin. He held a paper in his good hand. "Eviction!" Slade shouted. "The time is up. The structure is condemned. Get off my land, or I will burn it down with you inside." Eliza stepped off the porch. She stood next to Ezekiel Ward. Tubei stood on her other side, the hammer still in his hand. "It is not your land. Vernon," Ezekiel said, stepping forward. "You are fired. Ward!" Slade snarled. "You are done. I resign," Ezekiel said. "But not before I swore in a special witness." Ezekiel gestured to the tent. The district land proxy, the man from the hearing, stepped out. He looked terrified, but resolute. "Mr. Slade," the proxy squeaked. "I have reviewed the New evidence provided by Deputy Ward. Ezekiel held up the ledger and the heavy brass seal. Federal evidence. Ezekiel boomed. Grand larceny, cattle rustling, fraud against the territory of Texas, and attempted murder of a peace officer. Slade stared at the ledger. His face went the color of old ash. That is stolen property, Slade whispered. It is evidence, Ezekiel said. And this man, he pointed to the proxy, is riding to Austin tomorrow to present it to the U.S. Marshal, unless, of course, you want to confess right now and save us the trip. Slade looked at his men. They were backing away. They were hired guns, not suicidal loyalists. They saw the seal, the ledger, and the look in Ezekiel's eye. They turned their horses and rode away, leaving Slade alone. Slade looked at Eliza. He looked at the cabin solid, roofed, smoke curling from the chimney. He looked at Tubay, who watched him with a pity that was worse than hatred. You think you have won, Slade hissed at Eliza. But the winter is not over. The winter is just weather, Mr. Slade, Eliza said softly. We have a roof now. Slade yanked his horse's head around. He rode away into the twilight, a broken king in a kingdom that had rejected him. Night fell. The neighbors had packed up and gone home, leaving behind the warmth of a job well done and the promise of future friendship. Eliza and Tubay stood on the porch. The door was hung a solid oak door that shut out the wind. Inside, the fire was roaring in the hearth, drawing perfectly up the chimney. The smell of raw pine, hot tar, and wood smoke filled the air. It was the sweetest perfume Eliza had ever smelled. She looked at Tubay. He was leaning against the porch post, watching the stars appear. It is done, Eliza said. The roof is done, Tubay corrected. The home is just starting. He turned to look at her. The barrier was gone. The distance of the rules had evaporated in the heat of the work. You should come inside, Eliza said. It is cold out here. Tubay looked at the open door. For 5 years, he had slept under the sky, afraid to be enclosed by walls because walls felt like a coffin. But this cabin, he had bled for this. He had nailed it together. He pushed off the post. He walked to the door and stopped. Looking down at her, I am not a tame man, Eliza, he said quietly. I will always listen to the wind. I do not want a tame man, Eliza replied, reaching out to take his hand. Her fingers interlocked with his, calloused palm against calloused palm. I want the man who built this. She pulled him gently. Tubay stepped across the threshold. The door closed behind them, shutting out the vast, lonely night and sealing in the light. The wind that howled around the corners of the cabin that night was the same wind that had screamed through the valley for 1,000 years. It was the same wind that had frozen the marrow of the buffalo and snapped the branches of the ironwood trees. But inside the 4 walls of the cabin at Willow Draw, the wind was nothing more than a memory, a powerless ghost scratching at a door that would not open. The fire in the stone hearth cracked and popped, sending showers of bright orange sparks up the chimney draft. The heat was substantial, a physical weight that pressed against the cold air trying to seep through the chinking. It smelled of pine resin and the rich, dark scent of burning oak. Eliza May Carver stood by the table, her hand resting on the smooth wood of the surface she and Tubay had planed together. The oil lamp cast a golden circle of light, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stillness. It was finished. The deed was done. The roof was sealed. The door was hung. Earlier that afternoon, the drama in the town square had dissolved not into a gunfight, but into the slow, grinding gears of bureaucracy. The United States Marshal, summoned by the urgent telegraph Ezekiel Ward had sent the moment Slade fled, had arrived with a squad of deputies. They had taken the ledger. They had taken the brass seal. Vernon Slade had not been hanged. That was the stuff of dime novels. In the reality of the Texas frontier, men like Slade had lawyers as sharp as skinning knives. He had been charged with fraud and grand larceny, his assets frozen, his claim on the water rights nullified. He had ridden out of Red Mesa 2 hours ago, flanked by his sullen men, heading for Austin to fight a battle in a courtroom rather than a canyon. He was beaten, but he was alive, and the look he had cast toward Willow Draw as he left was a promise that hate, like bindweed, has deep roots. But he was gone, and for the first time in 6 months, the land under Eliza's feet felt solid. She turned to look at Tubay. He was standing near the door, his back to the wood. He was still wearing his heavy coat, though the room was warm. He looked out of place in the domesticity of the cabin, a creature of the wild trapped in a box of straight lines and right angles. He was watching her, his dark eyes unreadable in the shadow of his hat brim. "You can take off your coat," Eliza said softly. "The wind is not coming in." Tubay hesitated. To remove the coat was to disarm. It was to accept that the fight was over. He reached up slowly with his good hand and unbuttoned the heavy wool. He slid it off his shoulders, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at the bandage on his left side. He hung the coat on the peg by the door. Underneath, he wore a simple buckskin shirt, stained with the sweat of their labor and the blood of his sacrifice. Eliza walked over to him. She did not stop until she was standing inside his personal space, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. "Let me see the shoulder," she said. Tubay sat on the edge of the low bed they had built in the corner. He allowed her to untie the leather laces of his shirt. Eliza peeled the fabric back, exposing the skin. The wound was clean. The bleeding had stopped, leaving a dark, angry scab where the bullet had torn through the muscle. It would scar. It would be another white line on his map of pain, joining the jagged mark on his hand. Eliza dipped a cloth into the basin of warm water she had set on the hearth. She cleaned the skin around the wound, her touch feather-light. "It will heal," she said. "Flesh heals," Tubay murmured, looking at the fire. "It is the easiest thing to mend." Eliza paused, her hand resting on his uninjured shoulder. She felt the tension in him, the coiled spring of a man who expects the roof to collapse at any moment. "Why are you still shaking?" she asked quietly. "I am not shaking," he lied. "You are vibrating like a bowstring." Eliza corrected him. She moved around to face him, forcing him to look at her. "Slate is gone. Tubay, the deed is locked in the tin box. The door is barred. We are safe." Tubay looked up at her. The lamplight caught the sharp angles of his face, softening the harshness of his features. "Safety is a season," he said. "It passes. I sat on that ridge for a long time. Eliza, I watched you because I knew that if I came down, if I stepped into your circle, I would have something to lose again." He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and took her hand. His grip was rough, calloused, but incredibly gentle. "I have buried a wife," he whispered, the words dragging out of him like stones. "I have buried a son. I did not think I had enough heart left to bleed for another." Eliza looked at him, her own heart aching with a fierce, protective love. She understood now. His silence, his distance, his rules, they were not rejection. They were a dam holding back an ocean of grief. "You were wrong," Eliza said firmly. She stepped closer, moving between his knees. She placed her hands on his face, cupping his jaw. "You did not have to bleed to prove you were here," she said. "But you did. And now, you are not going back to the ridge. You are not going back to being a ghost." She leaned down and pressed her forehead against his. "Family is not something that falls from the sky. Tubay," she whispered. "It is not luck. It is not magic. It is like this cabin. It is something we build, log by log, day by day. We built this, and we will build the rest." Tubay closed his eyes. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for 5 years. The tension drained out of his shoulders. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her close, burying his face in the fabric of her dress. He held her with a desperation that spoke of freezing nights and empty horizons. He held her as if she were the only anchor in a spinning world. "Stay," he breathed against her stomach. It was not a command. It was a plea. "I am not going anywhere," Eliza whispered back, stroking his hair. "I am home." The fire crackled, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. Outside, the winter stripped the trees bare, but inside, in the warmth of the lamp and the beat of two hearts. The first seed of spring had already been planted. The thaw came in March. It began with the sound of dripping water, a relentless, musical plinking as the icicles on the eaves surrendered to the sun. The snow retreated from the valley floor, revealing mud that was rich and black and smelling of life. The creek, which had been a frozen ribbon of silence, roared back to life. Fed by the meltwater from the high country, the community of Red Mesa had changed with the season. Ezekiel Ward was no longer a deputy. He was the sheriff. The town council, shamed by their complicity with Slade and impressed by Ezekiel's courage, had voted him in unanimously. He had paid off his debt to the forge with the reward money for the recovery of the stolen cattle ledgers. But he kept the anvil. He said a man needed to hit something hard every now and then to stay honest. He rode out to Willow Draw every Sunday. He claimed it was to check on the peace, but mostly it was for Eliza's biscuits and to smoke a pipe with Tubay on the porch. He was the bridge, the black iron span connecting the white town and the red earth of the valley. Clara Pike had retreated into a bitter, quiet obscurity. She still sat in the front pew at church, but the circle of gossip around her had shrunk. The women of the town had seen Eliza Carver standing on a roof with a hammer in her hand, and they had seen the Comanche warrior take a bullet for her. The reality of that courage was harder to dismiss than a rumor. They did not all love Eliza. Prejudice is a weed with deep roots, but they respected her. And in the West, respect was a currency more valuable than affection. Life at the cabin settled into a rhythm of labor and discovery. Eliza planted a garden on the south side of the house, turning the earth with a spade while Tubay built a fence to keep the deer out. It was a strange sight. A Comanche warrior, a man born to roam the boundless plains, sinking posts for a fence. "You are boxing the land," Tubay grumbled one morning, wrestling a cedar post into a hole. "I am protecting the carrots," Eliza replied, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Unless you want to hunt deer every night because they ate our winter supply. Deer taste better than carrots," he countered, but he tamped the dirt down around the post with care. They learned each other's languages in the quiet hours of the evening. Eliza taught him to read the English Bible and the Farmer's Almanac. Tubay taught her the names of the wind. He taught her that the breeze from the south brought rain, and the sharp gust from the north brought change. He taught her which plants could stop bleeding and which roots could make a tea to break a fever. They were building a third language, a pidgin of English, Comanche, an intimacy that belonged only to them. One afternoon in late April, Ezekiel rode into the yard. He was not smiling. His face was somber, and he had a bundle wrapped in a blanket strapped to the back of his saddle. Eliza wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the gate. Tubay came from the barn, a hammer in his hand. "Sheriff," Eliza greeted him. "You look heavy today." "I am carrying a heavy thing," Ezekiel said. He dismounted and untied the bundle. It was not a thing. It was a child, a boy, no more than 6 years old. He was thin, his ribs showing through a tattered shirt. His hair was black and matted, and his eyes were wide, dark pools of terror. "Found him hiding in a root cellar at the old Miller place," Ezekiel said gently, setting the boy on the ground. The child shrank back against the horse's leg. "His people, a small band of Quahati, they came through a week ago, ran into a cavalry patrol near the river. It went bad." Tubay dropped his hammer. The sound was loud in the quiet yard. He walked forward slowly. He crouched down, ignoring the sheriff, ignoring Eliza. He looked at the boy. The boy looked at him. He saw the braids. He saw the face that looked like his father's, like his uncle's. Tubay spoke a few words in the dialect of the plains, soft, clicking sounds. "Numu Tekwa, do you speak the people's tongue?" The boy nodded imperceptibly. He whispered a single word. "Apu, father." Tubay flinched as if struck. He shook his head slowly. "No, not father, but friend." He looked up at Eliza. His eyes were wet. The grief of his own lost son was there, raw and open. But there was something else too, a question. Eliza looked at the boy. He was another stray, another broken thing washed up in their valley by the cruelty of the world. She looked at the garden she was planting, the fence Tubei was building. They had built a home large enough for 2. Was it large enough for 3? "Does he have a name?" Eliza asked Ezekiel. "He says his name is Little Stone," Ezekiel said. Eliza walked over to the boy. She did not crowd him. She knelt down beside Tubei. "Hello, Little Stone," she said. "We have a fire inside, and we have stew. It has carrots in it." The boy looked at Tubei. Tubei nodded. "The carrots are good," Tubei said solemnly. "She grew them." The boy stepped away from the horse. He took a hesitant step toward Tubei, then another. Tubei reached out his hand. The boy took it. Eliza stood up, her throat tight. She looked at Ezekiel. "Leave him," she said. "He is home." The weeks flowed into summer. The valley turned a deep, vibrant green. Little Stone, who Eliza insisted on calling Samuel, though Tubei still called him by his Comanche name when they were hunting, thrived. He was wild at first, hoarding food and hiding under the bed when strangers came. But the rhythm of the cabin, the steady presence of Tubei, and the fierce, quiet love of Eliza wore down his defenses. One evening in July, the air was sweet with the scent of clover. The sun was setting, painting the sky in strokes of violet and gold. Eliza stood on the porch, drying her hands on a towel. She watched the yard, by the corral. Tubei was teaching the boy how to rope a post. The man's patience was infinite. He guided the small hands, correcting the grip, showing him how to flick the wrist. The loop flew out, settled over the post, and pulled tight. The boy shouted in triumph. Tubei laughed a deep, booming sound that echoed off the canyon walls. Eliza felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. It was not the giddy happiness of a fairy tale. It was the solid, heavy contentment of a job well done. It was the feeling of a roof that does not leak, and a wall that does not bow. Tubei looked up and saw her watching. He said something to the boy, patted him on the shoulder, and walked toward the porch. He moved differently now. The hunted look was gone from his eyes. He walked with the easy stride of a man who owns the ground under his feet not by deed, but by right of care. He stepped onto the porch and stood beside her. He did not touch her, but he didn't have to. The connection between them was as tangible as the wood beneath their boots. "He learns fast," Tubei said, looking at the boy who was now trying to rope the confused mule. "He has a good teacher," Eliza said. Tubei leaned against the porch railing. He looked out toward the ridge, the high, limestone spine where he had sat for so many months. A lonely sentinel watching a woman struggle in the snow. "I went up there today," he said quietly. Eliza looked at him. "To the ridge?" "Yes, I stood where I used to sit." "And what did you see?" Tubei turned his head. He looked at the cabin, the sturdy logs, the smoke rising from the chimney, the garden bursting with life. He looked at the boy playing in the dirt, and finally, he looked at Eliza. His face, once a mask of sorrow, was open. The scars were there, but they were no longer fresh wounds. They were history. "I saw a ghost," Tubei said, "but he was fading. The wind has blown him away." He reached out and wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her into his side. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. "It is a good view from up there," he said, "but it is better from down here." Eliza looked out at the darkening valley. The fireflies were starting to blink in the tall grass. The creek murmured its endless song. They had been broken people, discarded by a hard world. They had been enemies by blood and strangers by custom. But they had taken the wreckage of their lives, the charred wood, the rusted nails, the old griefs, and they had built something that could withstand the winter. "Yes," Eliza whispered, closing her eyes and breathing in the scent of pine and sage and family. "It is." The cabin stood firm under the vast Texas sky. The smoke from the chimney rose straight and true, a prayer of gratitude drifting up to the first stars. She was building her cabin one log at a time, and he was building his courage the same way until a home finally meant we. Thank you so much for listening to this story of Eliza and Tubei. I hope their journey from the frozen winds of isolation to the warmth of a shared hearth touched your heart as much as it did mine to write it. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Are you in a cabin in the woods, a busy city apartment, or somewhere in between? Please leave a comment below and share your thoughts on the story. If you enjoyed this tale of the Wild West, please consider subscribing to the channel Wild West Tales, hitting that like button, and pressing the hype button to help this story reach more listeners. Your support keeps the campfire burning and the stories coming.